Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's AMA and Roundtable. We're going to give people just a few minutes to join, so please be patient while we wait for others to join. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And so hello and welcome to all of our attendees today, as well as our panelists. This is the August 26th or August AMA. We do these once a month, so the next one will be around the 3rd or 4th week of September. Today's focus is on automation, security, and compliance, facts, myths, questions, everything you want answered. And in a few minutes, I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves who is a panelist on today's conversation. First, I wanted to just give a couple of housekeeping items. We do have an opportunity to ask questions throughout the call, in addition to those that were completed and submitted during registration. So if you do have a question, if you go to your Zoom sort of control bar at the bottom, you can use either the Q&A feature or the chat feature throughout today's call to ask any questions, clarifying questions that may be based on something one of our panelists says, or to give any comments or feedback. So please do use those two features. I'll be monitoring that throughout and making sure we surface those to our panelists. And one more thing before we get started, I just wanted to let everybody know that just today, we announced a brand new product tour and freed up the AWS credential usage in ShuttleOps. So for those that are interested in trying out ShuttleOps to build and deploy your applications, you can sign up today at app.shuttleops.io. We do have this new integrated product tour, and we are offering free AWS credentials. So you have absolutely no money needed to get started building and deploying your apps today. And we will share this URL as well as some detailed instructions after the call with all those who attended and registered. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and just do a quick cross-check. I hope everybody can see everybody's faces on the screens all at once. But with that, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Jason Kretsch. I head up sales here at ShuttleOps. I'm sorry, I'm signed into the wrong account, unfortunately, so you can call me ShuttleOps as well. And let's turn it over to our other panelists to introduce themselves briefly. I'm going to start with Ryan.
Hey, my name is Ryan Bonner. I work at ShuttleOps. I do a lot of consulting around all sorts of different DevOps processes, a lot of which sort of pertains to security and compliance. So a lot of hands-on work with tools like Chef Habitat, Chef Infra, some of the HashiCorp products like Terraform. Yeah, so a lot of different perspectives. I guess my background comes from more the sysadmin and operations side. So only in the last sort of 3 years or so have I sort of shifted focus towards the cloud and more DevOps type workflows. But yeah, I think that's a decent summary.
Now you get to call on the next person.
Jan's pretty similar, so I'll let him piggyback off of me.
Cool.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan. I work with Ryan and Jason. I am also a consultant. I do a lot of technical work with managing AWS accounts, infrastructure as code using Terraform, and I feel pretty passionate about the subject of security and compliance because I used to be an in-house engineer before I became a consultant, where I worked on self-managed Kubernetes clusters in a company that was in the health tech industry. So we were a startup and we had to go through SOC 2 compliance and we had to go through HIPAA compliance with self-managed Kubernetes clusters. So that was a fun experience. And yeah, I'm just here to join the discussion and I'm glad to be here. So I'm going to call next on Scott.
Thanks very much. Yeah, hi, Scott Ford. Happy to be here. I'm a principal architect at Lacework, and my background is really in systems administration. I cut my teeth working for enterprises and really, big monitoring deployments. Nagios was my jam for a long time, so I built all kind of automation tooling to deploy Nagios configurations and deployments at scale on global data centers. But that planted a bug in me of just a love of automation. I ended up joining Chef Software and worked there for a number of years. But I'm over here at Lacework now, and my team and I are building a lot of tooling, open source projects that allow our customers to automate and inject security into their process continuously. So build time, run time, everything. So happy to be here. I'm going to call on my friend Neve.
Thank you, Scott. Nagios, we're going to have to talk about that later. So my name is Neve Cahill. I'm Solutions Architect Manager at Chef. My background is actually in large-scale network monitoring and mobile wireless networks for about 16 years. And then I switched over to DevOps and joined Chef. And it has been a whole new awesome experience over here. So many wonderful new folks that I've met, both on the customer side and working within Chef. I love automation in general and just all the capabilities that are now coming to the table. It's also getting super complicated out there because, you know, it's not like we just get to drop the old legacy backend stuff because we have new ways of deploying things or new architectural patterns. So I have all the empathy for people who are trying to get, you know, up to speed in DevOps and out the door with, you know, compliance as code and security and pipelines, etc. So really looking forward to chatting to everybody today. And I'm going to call on Brittany.
Last but not least, right? So I'm Brittany Woods. Currently, I'm an automation engineer with Carfax. So my role right now is pretty heavily focused around things like infrastructure as code and infrastructure automation. I focus quite a bit on things like Terraform and Chef, Chef Infra. So personally, though, I find it my duty to shout into the Twitter voids about DevOps and do those things. So I'm super excited to be here with all these smart humans talking about the DevOps. So
awesome. Well, thanks. And thank you everybody for being here, as well as to our attendees. So, you know, this is a interesting sort of headline topic: automation, security, and compliance. If you probably walk down the street and ask 3 different people what those words mean, you'd get 3 different answers. My favorite form of automation is my Roomba robot that vacuums the dog hair off the floor every day, but that's not the type of automation we're here to talk about today. So in the context of DevOps and the context of DevSecOps, a flavor of DevOps, or arguably the same thing, I guess starting with one question is, what does automation mean to you and how does it relate to security and compliance? Loaded question, but let's get started. And I'm not calling on anybody, so hit your buzzer and start.
Yeah, I'll go first. Oh, okay, never mind. Go ahead. Okay. I think in the context, if we're going to put all 3 terms together, so if we're going to, especially automation and compliance together, I think it's important to split up the term automation. So if you're a DevOps engineer, or if you're a developer working on a full stack team working closely with DevOps engineers, then obviously you're familiar with some sort of DevOps pipeline that takes your code and builds some sort of artifact out of it, maybe creates a Docker image, pushes it to a Docker registry, then later, you know, that runs in production on a Kubernetes cluster. So you have your automation for your actual DevOps processes, right? And then you can also have automation that's related to security and compliance. So within that same pipeline that creates a Docker image, you could also use something like Quay.io's Clear Scanner or Aqua Security's Trivy Scanner to actually scan for vulnerabilities within the Docker image. And that could be, you know, packages that are out of date on the base image. And that might mean that you need to use a newer base image. Although interestingly, a lot of people don't seem to care too much about vulnerabilities in the container because they say that it's inherently more secure anyway. But you can also scan for vulnerable NPM packages. Maybe Ruby gems, right? So you have the compliance automation there, or you can have something like Nessus, you know, running scheduled scans on boxes that you manage, right? so there's two types of automation there. But I think having a poor DevOps process, so aside from compliance, aside from scans or anything, having a poor DevOps process that is perhaps manual, or it was built in a poor way. For example, it might be maybe your DevOps automation includes provisioning instances, and you do that with some sort of administrator IAM credentials on AWS, right? Like like the automation itself can affect compliance as well. So yeah, I don't know. It's a good place to start when you have those three terms on the board, is to start dissecting them and seeing what kind of automation we're talking about and how it relates to compliance.
I like your point, Jan, about baking the compliance into the automation as well. I learned this a really hard way when I accidentally committed my AWS secrets key at 1 a.m. when I was working on something, and it was completely inadvertent. But I think if you have good pipeline hygiene, and it was actually committed to a public repo for its words, which caused chaos, but it was like nothing bad happened. But if you have hygiene in your pipeline and make it easy for folks to adhere to standards around things like secrets management and deployment best practices, and bake that into your standards, I think that foundational automation makes it easier for everybody going forward. Because if I see a pattern about how to integrate with HashiCorp Vault, no matter what I'm deploying, right? Whether it's, even if I'm deploying Kubernetes or some kind of container architecture, you still need to probably encrypt and manage application tokens and secrets. The clearer you are and more automated you are around that, I think you'll get other teams to adhere to those standards, and you'll have an overall more secure approach and pipeline.
Yeah, to Neve's point on that, I think I'm always kind of in the camp of, make security or securing your stuff easy. Because if you want people to adopt these principles, like securing their pipeline and baking all of that in, there has to be a lot of work up front to make it easy for them to do so. Because if it becomes cumbersome or limiting or causes them to have to work more cycles, they're just simply not going to do it. So I think, to her point, like, it's super important to, develop those patterns, and just having the automation doesn't necessarily mean things are going to be secure.
God, we could spend probably the rest of this 45 minutes on just this first question alone. It's crazy, right?
Go for it.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, there's so much to get into, and everybody's touched on so many relevant points here. I mean, I just think of automation as, humans are not good at repetitive tasks. Like Neve just talks about, 1 a.m., right? That's what humans do. At 1 a.m., we're not thinking straight. And so we fat finger a command, or we do something, or we check in our keys, right? But what automation is taking these repetitive tasks, giving you the opportunity to run them in an automatic fashion, right? So whatever that is, you just have an automated way, an automatic way to run repetitive tasks that humans are bad at. But with that too, comes all these opportunities for security to be injected. So we could dive into pipelines specifically, but if you think about pipelines, there's lots of automated things that happen in a pipeline. But there's also security that comes in using pipelines, where I could configure my pipelines to say, I can't check in my own changes, right? So somebody else has to review it. So maybe at 1 a.m., I'm like, well, I pushed my change, but someone else will have to review it tomorrow, and then hopefully they'll catch that I catch my key. So there's lots of areas when we talk about this automation, to add security and compliance too, right? Because there's some compliance that applies to configuration on systems, but there's also compliance in process. Who made the change, who approved the change, and all that. And I think that we're all learning that this isn't just something that we're all feeling like this feels right. This is actual science now. We're seeing, State of DevOps report are showing the findings of this stuff. So it's, to me, I think of it as those two things. There's taking manual steps and turning it into an automatic way to run those manual steps. And then with that, where do we want to inject security into this? It's from end to end. There's so many places to do that.
I heard a really interesting point in there, and I'm typing sort of notes as each of you speak, but I heard some nugget of automation also makes it it lowers the barrier to then approaching incorporation of better security and or compliance, because to your point, Scott, it removes what humans aren't necessarily good at, repetitive tasks. Security and compliance are sort of repetitive in nature. It's a, define it, maybe redefine it a couple times, but also just, check and balance against what the standards are, what the needs are. So like, it sounds like there's a notion of it actually decreases the barrier of adoption. Or one of the questions we got was, what percentage of people have effectively sort of integrated SecOps with DevOps, and maybe part of that has to do with automating things so that you can drive that integration between the teams.
That's a super specific question. I tried to take a stab and figure that one out. I don't know if somebody wrote a white paper and did a study asking exactly that question. It's a very good question. The only thing that I could find is that this is a DevOps.com article that I could just paste in the chat. But so they asked, I think 654 respondents, and only 10% said that they're doing DevSecOps properly. And
how do they define DevSecOps properly, though? Like, what does that mean exactly?
It's vague, and it's the same thing as DevOps engineer, which I don't think is really a role necessarily. It's more of a DevOps. Well, DevOps shouldn't necessarily be a role. DevOps is a movement, right? And we could talk about that for a long time. But it's just organizations are looking for the right people to do everything that Scott said, for example, to reduce the overhead of repetitive tasks, which ultimately reduces risk in an organization, which is why people want to adopt DevOps. One of the reasons people want to adopt DevOps. And sorry, I think it's not actually DevOps.com. There's another article, Health and Security, that said 8% achieved DevSecOps. This is from 2018, which is pretty vague. I'll just put it. All panelists and attendees, here you go. You can read that.
I think that's interesting though, because so I think that's inherent to the movement though, right? Because initially you had DevOps and then everyone was like, oh yeah, DevSecOps, but most people were new to adopting DevOps. And so now we're at this evolution point where everybody's seeing, oh no, there is value in including security as part of our DevOps, mentality, and starting to really include security and making security easy and include it in our pipelines and processes, because not only does it make us safe, but it also inherently allows people to focus on more valuable endeavors in the business, which is kind of the overarching goal of DevOps anyway. So I think it's a natural evolution. So I think in saying that, it's also a new evolution. I think it's easy for us to say, oh, DevSecOps was a thing 2 years ago, but it wasn't. DevOps was a thing 2 years ago, and now we're seeing that evolution where we're bringing in Sec.
It is funny though. What I saw too, though, to back up what Jan was talking about is like the 2016 State of DevOps report. Like I think of that as probably the best science we have as far as the data behind all this. Is like it talked about how security teams are spending this percentage less time remediating security issues in production and so on. But if you look at the 2019, and I just had to go find it and pull it up. So they have this that shows low, medium, high elite performers and the percentage of adoption. And it's like automated build, automated unit tests, automated acceptance tests. And you look at the elite performers and things like build and automated unit and acceptance tests, it's 92%, 87%, 58%. But if you get down to elite performers in automated security tests, it's 31%. It's really interesting. Like I was kind of, whoa, I was not expecting that. But I do think that it's like, it's a maturity. Like I have yet to hear any company that's pushing back like, no. We don't believe that you need more automated security. That everyone's there. They're just at some level of the maturity of how far along. So including
it's definitely a curve,
it's right? A continuous improvement process. Yeah.
It's like what Brittany said, it's an evolution, which means you're going up like this. And I think that doing vulnerability scans for libraries, scanning your images, scanning your containers as you're building them, that kind of thing, that's one part of it. But then there's, after your deploy phase, I think a lot of folks think, hey, we're going to put this in a container, it's automatically immutable and easy peasy lemon squeezy, we're good to go, we're secure, right? And a lot of the time, there are other layers that are wrapped around that. Is it better? Yes, absolutely. Is it 100% secure 100% of the time? No, and I think a lot of, there's assumptions around that, I think, that you really, that unit testing, functional testing, making sure you're running things properly out in the wild is extremely important. I'd see that as part of probably the elite performers.
Well, I was thinking about that statistic of 31%, which Michael, one of our participants, also shared, Scott. But, the data breaches and the issues that you see in the news are often with people that have relatively good DevOps practices in place, but maybe haven't gone down the path of fully integrating security and vulnerabilities check. As an example, one of the companies that checks my credit on a regular basis goes through these challenges, right? And, they've got good DevOps practices in place, but not the DevSecOps practices in place. So it's interesting. So it seems there's a lot of groundwork. And just really quickly from the survey that I just posted, I asked what are the biggest obstacles in terms of integrating and security and compliance into your development operations? And the number one response is that the teams are siloed, which, ultimately breaks down, back to the adoption principle, you have to adopt these things across teams in order to get them integrated. So like, I guess next question, that's a lot of, complex stuff that we're talking about here. We're talking about, pipeline hygiene, number one, and automation around that, getting yourself to a DevOps place. If you were to sort of call out like two things that you've seen where people have really integrated the notion of security compliance into their DevOps practice and thus become DevSecOps, what are the things that kind of like you've seen really indicate success in doing so? What are the things that you've seen as failure points?
I'll be happy to jump on that one. So the things I've seen work, the times where I've seen this work, and this applies to DevOps as well as DevSecOps. It's the companies that emphasize what you just touched on right there, which is that this is first and foremost a collaboration problem to solve rather than it is, or, the cultural part. Like I know most of you on this call, and we know that a huge part of this is not a technology problem. So it's those companies that emphasize on collaborating together as teams and put that first as a priority, and collaborate together to move the needle. And I also think that what I've seen, the best deployments or transformations also involve a leader that's willing to be there and remove obstacles. Like you're going to hit blockers, and you have to have somebody that's willing to go, no, this is a thing that we're investing in as a company. We're all getting on board this because it's proven. We need to do this. And so we're going to collaborate together. And every time they hit a wall, that person can help go and remove that obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Scott.
I think that's key, right? Because do we all remember ITIL? I'm probably dating myself, right? So I actually worked in a team that implemented ITIL successfully, which is the only scenario I've ever seen this occur. But it was because of somebody like that who went to all of our different business units. We managed 186,000 servers at the time. And they said, look, this is what we're going to do, and this is why. We had a shared services model. But because this person was particularly passionate and very able to navigate the organization and understood who they needed to talk to in order to make this change, we actually managed to automate a ton of stuff. And this was like obviously precursor to DevOps, but it's a very key point that you have to like get people on board. I also think that when we talk about like elite performers and having all the teams collaborate, we often think, oh, the developer teams and the operations folks, but it's got to extend out now even into, desktop teams, especially with everybody working from home, right? And for things like that terrible Garmin hack and ransomware and that kind of thing, those attack vectors are through the desktop. And what's really interesting to me is the Google Beyond Corp model. If all of you have heard of that, it's basically zero trust security model, but it essentially makes sure that the you're only allowed to access what you need and that you're secure. So no matter how you're coming into the network.
Okay.
I think to the point about silos, I think Jan can probably attest to this as well. Like, we'll go into these engagements at small companies, large companies, and the trend is typically always the same. You'll get to the point where you have to engage the operators, and you ask, where's the GitHub repository where your hardening scripts are located? And it's not a GitHub repository, right? It's a network share, and that one operator is the only one who knows how to run the script. He has a Word document that describes it step by step, how you run it and when you run it. And so, typically we end up having to start from scratch, onboarding these operators to get used to using, source code type practices and sort of build up from there, right? And it's a very common trend that we see in all sorts of engagements. That siloed wall between operators, security, and developers.
Ryan, how do you coach and encourage folks who are used to doing things manually in that scenario? Like, how do you get them excited about it?
Well, like, speaking just from my own personal experiences, like, that's the world I came from, right? I used to be that administrator. I used to store my install scripts on a network share. Granted, this was at a smaller company and it predated DevOps a bit, but the fact of the matter is those operators have just as much of an appreciation for automation as sort of modern day DevOps people do, right? Or software developers do. The same satisfaction a software developer gets from being able to compile their source code automatically into an artifact, an operator would get the same sort of satisfaction from knowing that they have to press a button once instead of 1,000 times, right? And I think just getting into the GitHub flow, those types of things, those are satisfying things for an operator to get involved with. It's just oftentimes I think operators can put sort of the development workflow on a pedestal and think to themselves, I can't do this, but give them an hour or two with someone who's been there and done that, and I think they'll be surprised how easy it is to sort of get that ball rolling, right?
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's really all I had.
I was just gonna be like, I have always kind of preached the gospel of like fighting fear of DevOps and fear of automation with education, and lowering that barrier to entry, because I think as an industry we have kind of a habit of being like, oh, we're doing the DevOps, and then you ask what the DevOps is and we're like, oh, well, you don't know, you're not aware. But so I think that goes to some of Scott's points too of making security everyone's problem a little bit, because that's how you see successful organizations, is when security isn't just the security team that's like, oh, we're doing DevSecOps, let me consult with you. It's more of, we have developers that are caring about securing your pipelines and securing your code and doing these long-term security efforts, and we have operations people that care about it too, and we all know what the common goal is. So if you bring in education, you bring in that care from manner of people in your tech org, I think that's how you get to be one of these high performers.
So everything that everybody just said, by the way, so Neve, Brittany, Ryan, Scott, it just made me reflect on, because I think, Scott, you mentioned this first, just having a good tech leader. So I think in most organizations, at least the ones that I'm aware of, is probably a good VP of engineering that can translate really what is going to give a good quality of life for developers, people who are doing DevOps, people who are doing security in an organization, which reduces the amount of manual things they have to do. They have automated processes that are that have good hygiene, as somebody mentioned, and could lead to, honestly, like we start with DevOps, right? So we said before we can do DevSecOps, we have to look at DevOps, and the benefit of that is that you're actually able to focus on pushing out code and delivering it faster, which is agile, obviously. And I don't want to preach to the choir or anything, but that's where we start with, right? And so you have to have a good leader that can say, well, if we're doing that, we can, deliver faster, and he or she, they can communicate with the management types, which like, low risk, they like delivering faster, whenever something is needed, right? So translate that and then allocate the right resources and say, no, we're doing this. We're going to have automated processes, so we're not doing things manually, right? And then you can introduce the security stuff. And I think what Ryan said with siloing, it made me think of something that I had the pleasure of asking one of my first DevOps managers, what is DevSecOps? And what they told me is that, when you have people who automate everything, you also have people that need to push back a little bit and make sure that the automation process actually revolves around security as well. And it can lead to auditability, so people can pass SOC 2 audits which are recurring also, right? And that's also back to the leadership. The leader, for example, they can say, well, this is actually going to, if we automate our pipelines in such a way, and if we add security and compliance related automation, then every 6 months when we have to go through the audit again, the recurring audit, we don't have to do a pause on development, right? So that's not going to slow it down. And the management types would love that, right? So it's that communication. And if you don't have that, and you have a security team that's pushing back, when it's time to deploy and get code out, but they're saying we have a SOC 2 audit, like we're not doing this. You get into this antagonistic mentality, which I've personally, I've been the antagonist to developers because of this. That's where you get the siloing. And Ryan, when you were telling me that story, I thought of probably the funniest thing that ever happened to me as a consultant. This is before lockdown and everything, when offices were still a thing, and I was at one of my favorite engagements, and we were creating a pipeline, and it was good to go, and we were so proud of it, and then it doesn't work. And because everything is air gapped in that environment, and the person I'm working with literally gets up, sighs, and walks to the other side of the office to talk to the security team. And if that's not the epitome of siloing, I don't know what is. So leadership is very important here.
At least they're able to walk over and talk to the team, because it gets even more complicated when the team is in a different continent or in a totally different time zone and you try to coordinate.
I think the sigh was the key point there.
Yes, no, I agree.
So I heard in that, so I heard in addressing the silos, like it's great to have like sort of leadership that cares about the pressures of getting to market faster and deploying your applications, in a more streamlined, effective way. And then you need to have somebody that's sort of taking the holistic view. We talk a lot about, in the DevOps world, sort of grassroots efforts to make DevOps happen. Like how, if you were an individual contributor or even somebody that's not quote unquote management type. I think I'm a management type, even though I don't have any people working for me, but I'll call myself a management type. How would you, as somebody that maybe cared about this, make the case that, like, what's the business value of doing this? How would you make that case? How would you get attention on this this topic if you were sort of looking at these things? Or if you're a team of one, how would you approach sort of doing this yourself? And taking it seriously as an organization?
I think Jan sold it kind of well. At the end of the day, just like anything else, even if it's not security, automation reduces the amount of time you have to repeat yourself, right? And that's money saved. So in terms of like how to do that, if you're a small shop, I think really like preaching the whole, I don't know how chef specific this term is, but the shift left mentality, how much of this process can I validate on my local laptop? I think that's like a great objective number one to set, right? Even outside of a specific context, right? Any process that I'm trying to validate for production, it's important that I try to do it as far left of the equation on my local machine as I can. And I think another key point to try to hold yourself to is everything is code, which is, when you tell that to an operator, sometimes a little daunting, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of brilliant operators out there who are really, really solid with things like Bash and PowerShell. It's still code at the end of the day, right? And so there's no reason you shouldn't be sort of source controlling those things and handling them in a more of a developer type workflow. And So I think those two, even outside of a specific mission of let's get compliance, I think just from a general sense of automation, trying to adhere yourself to sort of those 2 points to begin with is kind of a good place to start.
Okay.
I think also, oh,
go ahead. No. Go ahead, Brittany.
I was just going to say, I think it's also important to like bridge that divide too, because you often get it between developers, operations, whatever other teams you have. You have to bridge that gap. And for a lot of teams, like finding a pain point. So one of the common like initial ways to do that is to address like golden images or infrastructure as code or whatever. That's a common seg into DevOps. I think whenever you get your operations people comfortable in that world that developers live in all the time, that's a good way to start a DevOps movement without even having a company saying you're doing DevOps, because essentially what you're doing is bridging the divide and doing DevOps without doing it. So I think that's pretty important too.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. Sorry, Ryan.
No, I was just going to say like GitHub is like a perfect example of that. Like it's often a eureka moment for an operator to like start to understand that sort of GitHub workflow. And all it takes is just learning how to version a file and setting up a webhook. And then from there, the ideas start spinning, and it's crazy how fast it can take off.
Yeah, we actually do a workshop that's like a 3-hour workshop where we do introduce those concepts to folks who've always been sysadmins or even network engineers, right? Where I think getting out the door with the concepts, once you get your arms around it, to your point, Ryan and Brittany, I mean, it's, you know, it's really gratifying to see that eureka moment when folks suddenly realize like, this is going to make my life so much better. And it doesn't have to be massively complex either. So I think there's a high value there for sure.
Yeah, we talked about, the word silos gotten brought up a couple of times already on this call. And I think there's, if you're a party of one and you're trying to sell the value of this internally, I love the theme of inclusiveness that goes along with people that are really trying to practice a culture of DevOps, is that inviting more people in. So if you're a party of one and one thing you have to do is you kind of got to you got to build some stuff, but schedule a meeting, invite everybody and show them what you built. And maybe nobody shows up, or like you might have some other people, you might have just one other person who goes, you know what, I love that. And I have some ideas for that too. So let's start contributing together, and it grows from that point. But a shout out to our friend Nathan Harvey, who always talked about, there's companies who call these like centers of excellence, and it's communities of practice. You can develop these communities of practice internally at your company. Schedule a weekly demo, show them what you're building, and maybe nobody shows up, but eventually, it's proven. We're all here. We know this stuff really works, and it will grow.
Yeah. The alternative, to borrow a term from my buddy and colleague Shiv, is you can wait for the I'll use this nicer language, the aw crap moment, where you don't do any of this stuff to lay the groundwork around automation or incorporating security and compliance and shifting left, and then something goes horribly wrong, right? And you end up with a vulnerability or an attack or something going horribly. So like, that's another way to generate grassroots support, I guess, is wait for the aw crap moment, but I wouldn't encourage that. That just becomes a fire drill.
The flip side of that scenario is something does happen, but because you have at least foundational practices in place, being able to go, haha, hackers, I really don't care because I can rebuild like really fast, or, I have good DR practices. So not only am I able to redeploy really fast, but I also have backups. And I've seen companies where that happened, and it's just, it's a good moment, right? I would not like to be in the opposite situation for sure.
Yeah. Hopefully you won't be. Hopefully none of us will be. We have one question come in from the audience. So I'm just going to read this directly. Does anyone use TFS for DevOps, and any recommendations or suggestions to get the most of TFS for DevOps?
I'm not familiar with it personally. Not sure anybody else.
Everybody's Googling.
I worked with a team at while I was at Chef that was using TFS, and I you know, to me at the high level, they're all pretty much, you can do the same things with, you know, store and source control. You can use Git there, and you can define your pipeline. So I would say if you're just getting started, what I have seen people do is get caught up in kind of analysis paralysis of like, I got to write all the tests and do all this stuff. I wouldn't worry about that. I would worry about, first and foremost, just get a pipeline set up that ships your changes. And then from there, you're going to iterate at that community of practice. Just get better and better at it. Don't worry too much about it. So at a high level, all the pipeline technologies are pretty much operate in the same way.
Okay.
I'm such a huge advocate of that, yeah.
They all have their own library of, you know, basically plugins that you can leverage. There's different plugins for different things, like various levels of maturity. But I've been working a lot with Azure DevOps pipelines recently in this space, and there's a really nice library of plugins for that makes things very straightforward, as well as a lot of example patterns out there. So I would just start with something really straightforward as a use case and just take that to get out the door and then iterate from there.
Okay.
So TFS is just managed Azure DevOps, right? From what I'm seeing.
That's what I'm seeing, yeah.
It's the previous name for Azure DevOps was Team Foundation Server. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. No, we've used Azure DevOps before, and it's absolutely great. And so for somebody who's like a DevOps specialist or engineer, somebody who's worked with pipelines in the past, going into Azure DevOps and saying, okay, wait, so I can run pipelines, and there's an artifact store, and there's a VCS provider for Git, and there's like a Jira-esque sort of thing here as well. It's like a playground, right? But if you're just starting off with it, let's say if you're like a sysadmin who's never, I'm not saying like sysadmins are like, but I'm saying, let's say you're in that particular situation where you've never versioned a file before, where you just didn't have the luxury of doing that before. Maybe start with that, I think, as Scott was mentioning, just ease into it slowly.
We've actually been working on our team on a project where we're using Azure DevOps pipelines as a front end to patching target environments, where you might have somebody who doesn't know a whole lot about infrastructure as code, but they're able to basically look at a pipeline like that. And, you know, Azure DevOps makes it super easy to log in and just hit the button, input your list of servers you want to patch, hit the button, away you go. And there's a few different ways to manage that, but we've been playing a lot with that. So there's a number of different ways you can get out the door with that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, to Scott's point, it's just like the best place to start is just run like a basic shell execute, or like a basic, you know, starting there and then sort of building up into some of the more fancy plugins is, to me, the logical way to do it. But obviously everyone's a bit different. So, but stick with something you know, and don't get too confused by trying to, you know, use 5 different plugins in your first pipeline, right? Just keep it simple and build on it slowly.
Yeah, because DevOps tool set integrations are just effortless with the giant array of systems and tools you could use to accomplish the same thing.
It's fun.
I know. I always refer back to that Zevia Labs periodic table, which probably hasn't been updated in a long time, but it has like 700 different tools that span 25 different categories. And it's like, we talked about this a little bit last month, but if I were getting started in DevOps, like, how do you even know which tools to choose, right? Like, how do you know which one is going to work for your business best? Interesting. Okay. I have a kind of interesting future tripping thing. So put on your future tripping hats. Dometh, who's my boss, and I were talking a couple weeks ago, and he was like, you know what I think is going to be really weird is like when quantum computing comes on board and like hackers are able to like, you know, basically like execute, you know, hacking scripts against your systems, you know, at the speed of light or 10 times the speed that your systems and processes are going to be able to address them or deter them or even, you know, figure out how to avoid their patterns for attack. Like, gosh, what is that going to look like? So what do you think? So we're talking a lot about how to get to a DevSecOps thing to automate security and compliance. But if you were to think forward just a little bit, like, what do you think's coming down the pipe that's going to be a real challenge for people if they don't get started on sort of doing the stuff that we talked about today? Like, let's paint a little, I mean, it's almost October. We can talk about Halloween scary stories. What's your scary story that you would want people to avoid so that they get started with these types of initiatives within their organizations now?
I think ransomware. Oh, sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
I'll let you go first.
I was just going to say, I think that the attacks are becoming ever more sophisticated. I mean, even leaving quantum computing out of it. If you look at the likes of, the ransomware attack on Garmin, I'll go back to that example again, and the analysis, the level of sophistication in that attack was really, really high. Like, it was a JavaScript payload from a completely legitimate website that went into somebody's desktops, and then those propagation mechanisms are using PSExec and WinRM and other management tools within standard Windows environments to propagate themselves and do discoveries in the network. And they even have workarounds for things like Tripwire. And Scott, we worked on this habitat package. I cannot remember the name of it, but basically there's a tool that checks whether or not you're allowed to run an executable. They even have a way to work around that to bypass security mechanisms that are by default on a lot of servers. So I think just that level of sophistication and knowledge, it's not script kiddies anymore for the most part. It is these very, very sophisticated attacks combined with social engineering, right?
What's social engineering?
Yeah, you're touching on oh, sorry. No, please.
No, go, Scott.
Well, you're touching on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart and our hearts here at Lacework and what we're doing too, because that's just kind of the premise of what we've been focused on, which is that right now your option for trying to catch that is to write rules and to write some sort of test that are going to capture whether or not that is happening in your environment. But how do you do that? How do you future-proof that on patterns we've never seen before? Mm-hmm. Which is that I really think, what we're interested, what we built is it's all about understanding all this data and the way that things are changing in your environment and understanding what a baseline looks like, because what Carfax looks like is different than ShuttleOps, is different than Lacework, is different than Chef. And not only that, but from QA to prod to staging, those are all different environments with different patterns. And so making sense of all that data and being able to raise up anomalies and say, this is different right now than it was last hour, and it's different in a way that's big concerns that you have to go out and investigate. So there's so much noise and so much data and so much change, and this is going to be, it's the constant. We can all count on new technologies, new patterns that are going to exist out there. You're not going to be able to employ human beings to write those rules and try to determine. It just doesn't. Sorry.
Well, it's a path to false positives, right? And we've all been there with a whole bunch of noise coming out of security systems, and you don't know what is the real alarm here. I remember staring at IDS systems, so intrusion detection systems, and going, I think there's something going on, but I'm not 100% sure. So yes.
Neve, we have to talk about that Nagios thing, because that was the first thing I learned as a Nagios administrator. Was like, oh my God, I can write a Perl check for literally every single thing about the system. And the first thing anyone did was go, Outlook rule, send that thing to some folder and never pay attention to it. I think one of my colleagues said, at the point that you have 1,000 alerts a day, you effectively have no alerts because you're not going to pay attention to any of them. So how do you actually know what's relevant to investigate and dig into? That's a really important thing that we all have to deal with.
Yeah.
CrowdStrike was the name of the package I was trying to think of. So those ransomware packages, they're circumventing CrowdStrike now by detaching from the parent process. It's really impressive, from a tech perspective. So that scares the pants off of me.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that?
I think you asked about what's the nightmare scenario, and I think
of the future.
Of the future.
Yeah.
So I for me personally, it's not quantum computing. I think it's being in an organization where you didn't voice, maybe you're the expert in automating pipelines for, getting code into production. Maybe you're the expert who's gone through various security compliance audits, right? And you have concerns about the current processes, and perhaps your infrastructure is self-managed and it hasn't been touched in months. Your organization is not putting in the time to update that when you've already realized there's some faults. and you will just get to the point where you're kind of punting it off into the future, and then something bad will happen. I think that's the nightmare scenario. And I think that if you just adhere to best practices, for example, these days you could completely reduce your footprint. And for example, there are simple things you could do, like make sure that not anybody can attempt to SSH into your instances, right? You can actually, now with AWS, for example, you don't even have to use SSH at all. You could just use SSM and straight from the console, get into an instance, or you could, perhaps just use a managed orchestrator like AWS EKS and use their managed nodes, and you don't have to manage anything. Well, not everybody has the luxury of doing that, right? And then there are other things like maybe your organization has to get audited and they have to have, CAS hardened images for those Kubernetes nodes to pass that audit, to assist in passing the audit for SOC 2, for example, right? So there are different things you can do. But if you ignore the best practices, if you don't look at what other organizations have talked about in terms of reducing the footprint, if you don't, and I think Scott and Eve were talking about actually just having visibility and, whether it's a Elasticsearch or using a paid aggregator like Sumo Logic and having all the access logs there and having nice dashboards that are actually meaningful instead of just generating noise, that would be a best practice that would prevent you from prevent a disaster scenario. And I think that a lot of organizations are just underpowering certain departments, and engineers feel underpowered, or they don't have that leadership in place, or perhaps they're not voicing their opinion. One thing that I was told that really stuck with me is, if you're complaining about something that could have been done, 3 months ago, why weren't you kicking and screaming, right? Why were you not voicing your opinion? And that's kind of like the antagonistic way of doing that. But I think Scott also mentioned just having, like lunch and learns and things like that, which on paper, they sound a little bit cliche, but I've been in some, and if you make it not super high level, but you actually talk about, if you don't preach into the choir, but you actually talk about different technologies in the ecosystem today, those are really attractive. Like people who are full stack developers, they like hearing about DevOps. They like this, Kubernetes DevOps, microservice aesthetic. Same thing with people who are previously, grew up as network engineers. They love that. A lot of them love that kind of stuff. They want to learn. So if you actually stay on top of your stuff, if you're passionate about doing best practices, you can get a lot of people on board. You just have to do it. You can't just do your day-to-day thing and just keep things, keep your head above the water. You have to really go above and beyond and get people on board with you if you want to prevent that disaster scenario.
I think really quickly, my disaster scenario is also kind of a basic one, and that's re-siloing in the name of DevOps, because a lot of companies fall into that trap too, where they're empowering their users or their teams to, come up with the right solution for the job. But then you have small teams that form, and one team does it one way and another team does it another way. And then now we're doing the DevOps, but we're not, because we're in silos again. And so I think seeing that emergence is a nightmare scenario for me, and something that you should avoid if you're not in a fully mature DevOps model yet. I think you should be aware that that can happen, so you can take mitigating steps.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because it's like, when it comes to security silos, like it still makes sense to have security experts, right? Maybe they're external. Maybe there's someone wearing a cape sitting in a room somewhere that's deciding, this is how you should harden your Linux kernel. And I think that a security silo in that context still makes sense. And to some degree, there's some leap of faith you have to take to say, this person's doing their job correctly. And, I can make sure that this suite of controls that they've laid out for me is in place. But at some point, it's sometimes a little disheartening to think how complex this landscape is. And, there's going to be something that gets through the gaps at some point. And so to some degree, it's a sort of a best effort.
SMEs versus silos, it sounds like almost like, you know,
Yeah.
domain knowledge is super powerful, especially when you're talking about something complex like security or compliance, which take a certain brain type to kind of think about, but you don't want them so separated from what you're trying to do that you don't know what the hell they're up to, right? Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
it's
you're
almost
right.
become like a service now, right? So like you've got these experts that are packaging these things for you to consume, and it's up to you to trust them, right?
Yeah.
The key, I think, is again, it's collaboration. You don't have to be the person necessarily writing the code or contributing to the GitHub, or you know, but you can. But you know, security engineers that or security folks that are not coders have a huge role to play here. It's through collaboration, and so yeah.
Yeah, it's important that those people do it in an open source fashion as well. I think that's very important.
Well,
when you say open source, you mean like you know, within code review, those types of things.
Yeah, like it's nice to see you know, a repository somewhere, and that it is indeed a collaborative effort, right? That there isn't some sneaky person behind the scenes that making all of these decisions, and the world's just blindly trusting them. So
well, I also like, you know, there's a lot of open source security, like we talked about best practices. There's a lot of open source collateral and examples out there on GitHub around that, which I find super helpful. And you know, take specific tools out of it in general, just like, hey, you know, what are the best practices for running Kubernetes in prod, that kind of thing. So
totally.
I love that too. Super helpful.
Well, it is the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody who attended today's AMA on automation, security, and compliance, or security, compliance, and automation. I don't know what the right order of those words should be. Thanks to all of our panelists really for joining and sharing thoughts on this. We'll be posting a recap of this video as well as a brief summary blog post within the next 24 hours. And everybody who registered and attended for today's AMA will also receive a link for the invite for next month, where we will explore an entirely new topic in the area of DevOps, automation, security, compliance, and throw in every other buzzword. We'll figure out what the topic is. We welcome your feedback. But thanks again, everybody, for joining, and our panelists, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.